A very good morning from the Nudge Pool. We're here with Professor Robin Burgess from the London School of Economics. Robin, could you tell us a bit about your work into this field, working with Bangladesh, with BRAC, with poverty? How did it start? When did you start?
Yeah, I mean, I'd been to Bangladesh with my mum when I was a kid, like, because we lived in the Philippines and we stopped in Bangladesh on the way back to Scotland. But I guess it really started in 2006. I had a Thai PhD student, Pataporn Sukantamorn, and she was studying the BRAC schools, the informal schools that were set up when there was no other schools. And then I met Mushtaq Chowdhury, and I met Imran Matin, and I met Sirfase Abed around that time and heard about the graduation program. So the next year, much of 2006 is spent basically trying to convince BRAC that they should do an evaluation. They'd never done a randomized evaluation before. So it took a little while, but convinced them. And then we went into this very, very large panel trial, starting with 2007, so looking at women who were getting the program in 2007, and then looking at them again in 2009, 2011, all the way through several times to 2018, and then it's been a recent follow-up. So in 2024, so we've been following these women who had the 24-month program beginning in 2007. And I think what convinced me to put a lot of effort into this, I went out into the field with a translator and basically was introduced to women who had never had the program, pilot women who had for 2 years, and other pilot women had it for 4 years. And obviously when somebody like me shows up in the village, everybody comes out. And then I would ask questions, without telling anybody. And I'd also pick myself from the BRAC, which women to ask, so there wasn't sort of the perfect women being asked. And I became convinced that something had happened to those women who were in the pilot program. They were more willing to kind of stand next to the landowner, express their views. They were less retiring. They were more forthright. So something had happened in their lives, and I thought that's kind of interesting. Why don't we, that's what convinced me to kind of push for a randomized evaluation. So that was sort of the beginning of the association with BRAC. And for Sir Fazl Abbott, it was very encouraging. So I've met him a number of times, and he was always saying, we need more evidence of what works. And then over time, it sort of has moved into many areas, some of it in Africa, looking at training programs, vocational training programs that BRAC was helping young disadvantaged youth there, the adolescent girls program, and then lots of training programs in Bangladesh. And so we're kind of always open to what we can do with BRAC. I mean, I work a lot with a colleague at the LSE called Oriana Bandiera, and we always say that we'll do anything for BRAC. We don't do anything for anyone, but we'll do anything for BRAC.
Could you maybe tell us a little more about some of the insights from the study that you did, the original study, randomization of the graduation program?
Yeah. Yes, I think the big thing there was that in the first we had one paper published in 2017, I think, and that really showed that there was a big increase in the per capita expenditure of the household. And then many indicators of, where women were working. So basically, the lens we've worked out you want to think about is that women at the beginning, without the program, are working predominantly as domestic maids, agricultural laborers, and the third occupation, beggars. So these are people at the very, very bottom who have been identified by the community to be, everybody agrees that they're very bottom. So what happens is they have this new business, typically livestock, and they add hours. So they work more hours, but they work in a much more even way. So they work, when they do agricultural labor or domestic, it's very seasonal. And it's also very insecure. So some days if there's no work, there's no work. Whereas the livestock, you get this new source of income and it goes across the year. So you get an income across the year. And what we found is that that was transformational in terms of their ability to not only generate income and hence consumption, but as we tracked them for further, they started to acquire other businesses, like, a rickshaw that they could rent out, and then increasingly land. But much later, it took them a while to get the resources to get land. So basically, these were moving from the very bottom of the distribution in the village towards somewhere in the middle. And we're now starting to look at what's going to, what happened to their children. But it looked like even though they, from a macro perspective, the amount of resources they're getting are not huge, it was for their own lives, it was transformational. They were able to kind of get out of the most extreme forms of poverty. So that was sort of the first sort of set of findings.
Um, so these you were seeing, you're calculating these findings, and it showed up on paper. Personally, you spoke about what struck you was just the way the women were carrying themselves. Is there anything else that struck you personally from your years of working with on poverty in general in Bangladesh?
I mean, I think the biggest thing probably has been the fact that people are moving out of agriculture. So they're moving into non-agricultural, many different little things. Obviously, the men are migrating quite a lot. Some of the women are migrating. They're starting up small businesses, often in situ. And that's making a huge difference in terms of their ability to diversify income and to have and just much more secure livelihoods. So that's one set of aspects. The other one, which is also couples are much healthier and their kids are healthier. So there's also these effects on, and their kids are more likely to be educated. So they have I would say they have much more. They have longer horizons. They're thinking further out. So imagine if you were the daughter of an agricultural laborer. Probably that's kind of what you figured you'd be doing that, or you'd be a wife to somebody. And they have become more ambitious. They can see a larger horizon. So psychologically, there's been also a degree of empowerment, which is quite palpable.
You spoke at the beginning of the work that brought you this time to Bangladesh
Yeah.
about shocks, looking at how the program and this anti-poverty program work with shocks. Could you tell us a little bit about that and how did that start featuring? So this is environmental shocks. How did environment start featuring in your work with anti-poverty? So,
Yeah, I mean, I was originally a biologist, so I studied biology in my first degree, and so I've had a long-standing interest in the environment. But I think what sort of flipped things around is that I kept hearing about these. You'd hear a cyclone, you'd hear a drought, you'd hear a salinity, you'd hear flooding all the time, and it was Bangladesh probably more so than other countries, including the ones I worked in Africa, even more than Indonesia, or India. And I started thinking, oh, that's interesting. So what will this, why might the program help? So two things came together. One was that we'd worked out in a sort of a second paper that there was basically a threshold where if you got enough assets, then you moved out of poverty. So not everybody who got the program, about 70% got out and accumulated land and continued to kind of grow out of poverty, but some didn't. And so I was thinking, well, you know, in the traditional development economics literature, one reason why you fall back into poverty, you get a shock, you get a health shock, you get drought. And so if these shocks are happening more, then we need to think about whether or not the program is making people more resilient to that. So there was a combination of two things. One is I'd been working on another set of papers, which are all to do with deforestation and forest fires, and that made me able to use satellite data. Spent a long time working out how to do that. I thought, hey, we could combine these new technologies, the satellites coming and sensing droughts and floods, with this panel, because essentially what we're doing is we're saying if you have a woman who's for the initial randomization period, which was 2007 to 2011, if you're a woman that is in the control group and a woman who's getting the program, then did the woman who's getting the program, for a kind of similar shock, do better or not. And that got me really excited because it would basically flip the switch on thinking about graduation as an anti-poverty program to think of it as an anti-poverty program and a climate program. So that's what we did. We basically got, so 2007 to 2011, all the best shock data on droughts and floods. And what we basically find is that women are much more resilient if they've received the program. So it's what that means. It was really, really exciting because everybody around the world is trying to think about what do we do about adaptation, what do we do about climate. Suddenly, we have a program already in existence, proven for anti-poverty, and now we're showing that it is also able to make women more resilient to shocks. And what's interesting is in these villages, we have basically an ultra-poor group and then a near poor. So they're poor, they're identified as poor, but not for various reasons, not in the program. But they're a little bit richer than the ultra poor. Then you have the middle and rich. And essentially, we are also able to compare the near poor to the poor. And basically, what the program does is it moves them to the resilience levels of the near poor. So it makes them much more, a little bit like it made them sort of into the middle of the distribution. Also, in terms of climate resilience, it makes them more into the middle of the distribution. So it's an incredibly important finding because since this work has been, this is an innovation that happened in Bangladesh graduation, originally, by BRAC, but, been moved into government programs a little bit in Bangladesh, probably could be done more in Bangladesh, but it's now moved to many, many other countries, often implemented by government. So it means that you can now use a program that's already in existence to begin to kind of protect your citizens from, to get them out of poverty, but to also against these new risks. And the thing about climate change, a new set of risks, higher, more volatility on rainfall, more floods, more droughts, more extreme events like cyclones or hurricanes. So we find this results really, really powerful because it's sort of climate change policy has been sort of more in its infancy. And what we're saying is basically, hey, you don't have to kind of reinvent the wheel. And many programs that have been proven to be good for poverty now can be used to protect people from climate change. And that's a problem that's, common across. And the most affected places are in South Asia and Africa, exactly where BRAC is.
What are some of the mechanisms that show these results? Like, what is it about the UPG program that is protecting people against climate shocks? Did you find?
So it's interesting. It's quite similar to what's making them less poor. So the main thing is that when there's a shock, so imagine there's a woman and one woman just is an agricultural laborer and the other woman is an agricultural laborer and she has a cow. So in the case of a shock, the woman without the cow, say there's a drought and the landowner says there's a drought, there's no crops growing, so no work for you. So you're basically unemployed. So you have no income, right? So you basically, in extremis, somebody has to migrate, or you have to run down resources, or you have to do something to. In the case of having a cow, there's an income that continues to come in from the cow. So that would be things like, you're selling milk, or you're selling the meat from the cow, or you're selling the dung. And so what we're finding is that the women who have got the program have diversified their labor into husbandry in this case. And that's giving them a stream of income that then funds consumption in the time of the drought. So that's one mechanism, and that means you're continuing to get an income stream even though it's very hot outside or very dry. The second thing is diversification. So as I said before, many of these women move beyond the transferred assets. So they continue to do some agricultural labor. They don't give up on that, but they do less of it. They do much more husbandry. But they may then have a little shop, or they may have begun to own a little bit of land or rent a bit of land. And so basically through that diversification process, there's another potential income stream. Or they have a child that is, working in the city, or a husband that's working in the city, or there's a child working in the nearby town. And as you have that diversification of income streams, which has basically been triggered by the graduation program. because before everybody was in agricultural labor. Now they had no surplus. They basically living hand to mouth. Whatever was given, daily wage, they ate mainly. Virtually no savings, no asset. Part of the selection is based on that. But now you have these little income streams coming in. There's higher education happening, and that just makes the whole family more secure. So when a drought happens, the woman just with the just a family of agricultural laborers, they can't do anything. There's no work. They're thrown into unemployment. It's a very, very different situation. You want to think of graduation as basically triggering a set of things which then allow these women to themselves become more secure to these shocks, resilient to these shocks, but also their family members. It's not something that stops at the woman, because obviously resources are shared. And indeed, in many cases, the land cultivation is not done by the women, it's often done by the men. But the resources for renting or buying that piece of land would have come from the cow business.
Mm. In terms of the estimates you found, how protective is the program? So, how much does it protect compared to the control group? And how far do you think we can go with using programs that are targeted for poverty to adapt? Or do you see other bits coming in together,
Yeah.
and perhaps especially for BRAC, because they do so many other things as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think you don't want to, and we've never viewed it as a sort of panacea, but we're finding, at least for this period, 2007 to 2011, is that in terms of, like I say, the standard measure of welfare, which is per capita expenditure, standards of the poverty measure, that they're fully protected. So the control group have a massive fall in consumption per capita expenditure. They remain sort of insignificantly different from zero. So they're fully protected in that period. Now, of course, things are changing. Even since 2011, there's bigger shocks and so on, and there will be some shocks where, if we look at the very big shocks that are even within our period, there's definitely some women that are not fully protected. So what that raises is two things. There's obviously climate change is not a flat process. It's an increasing process. There can be more floods, more droughts, more heat, and so forth. So I think there's a couple of big areas that are going to come into focus. One is, of course, that you have in the case of a really big shock, so imagine like a cyclone that comes in, floods everything, including your cows and whatever. Then you're probably in the world where you need to cooperate more with government, because government typically is the one that's doing the big infrastructure project, seawalls, levees, a lot of water management. So I think there's a need to think of you're not going to solve everything from household transfers. You need to move into the infrastructure, government services that are going to need to be complementary to the household transfers. So I think that's one big area of work, which hopefully that can be encouraged, because governments do certain things, NGOs do certain things, and I think the knitting together of those two things can be very, very powerful in the case of climate change. The second area, which we know not a whole lot about, is obviously increasingly the poor in urban areas. So that if they're in urban areas, it becomes much more difficult, because we were just in Patna in Bihar just before Christmas, and there we're working with BRAC, but the main implementer is a government agency called Jivika. And they've had a very successful kind of BRAC-inspired but government-run rural graduation program. And now we're sort of helping them design and think about an evaluation for an urban program. And once we were going around the slums, and these are not established slums, either like floating slums, people under flyovers next to rivers, any bit of land that they can get into. It was clear that the identification is much more difficult, partly because they're mobile, partly because people don't know one another so well, so the community identification is also more difficult. But even more than that, what businesses could they run? They don't really have much land. They typically have no toilets. They certainly have no security over the land they're on. There's sporadic access to electricity, sporadic access. So there's many other constraints, but there's more and more of them around the world, including in Bangladesh. So I think we're going to have to think about how you adapt the graduation program for different contexts, like urban areas. And I guess the third area is that the livelihood promotion doesn't always have to go through, for example, livestock. Even in rural Bangladesh, they often pick different businesses, they often diversify into different businesses. So there may be other things, through agricultural extension, other ideas of where might livelihoods come from, what are the innovations, new types of agriculture, fish rearing, non-agricultural activities. So that's a sort of third bucket. And the fourth bucket, which is even less known about, is insurance. Because the whole idea, remember, the graduation programs, you want to think of it through the lens of occupation. That what it does is allows you to get into a slightly better occupation. And then from the surplus of that, you go into other, even better occupations, or your children go into better occupations. And so the idea is that it's an investment. You're investing in your cow business with your time and other resources. That's generating income, and that's getting you out of poverty. So if you have more and more sort of shocks around, then you need to have a mechanism for continuing that incentive to invest. And one very powerful way of doing that is insurance. If you know that, I don't know, your cow dies because it's too hot, something outside your control, that you're going to get an insurance payout, then you're much more likely to continue to invest. Otherwise, you might say, oh, it's too risky. I'm going to go for something safer but lower return. And I think insurance increasing, there's both micro insurance of that type, like you get a payout based on a weather reading or something. But there's also more kind of catastrophic insurance. So if a whole region of Bangladesh has a cyclone, is there a bond that local government would buy that then gets the payout? And that kind of thinking about insurance is happening, of course, more and more in different countries, happening in Mexico, it's happening in the Philippines. And I think BRAC itself in the microfinance team is increasingly thinking, how do we develop these micro insurance and macro insurance products? Because they're going to become much more important to allow people to continue to want to invest and to innovate their way out of poverty in what is, let's face it, a riskier environment.
Um, so on that note, could you maybe elaborate a bit more on the work that BIGD BRAC and LSE you're doing now with the UPG program and insurance?
Yeah, so what we're doing at the moment is a few things. One is um, simply to try to figure out whether there's new types of businesses that could be added into the existing structure of the UPG program. So we're in the field sort of figuring out kind of what people have been doing, on their own, innovating on their own, figuring out new ways of doing fish and rice or vertical gardening and, more drip feed agriculture, more drought resistant varieties, all that, because people are naturally going to be trying to adapt to this new situation. And then the idea is if we could add perhaps a second business. So many people want to do livestock. It's kind of tried and tested. They get good returns. But if we could add another sort of more climate adaptive business, then that might make them all. So we're thinking of doing an evaluation where you do a kind of standard graduation and then an augmented with some climate business. But as part of that, going beyond that, we're also thinking, could we have an arm where you also got an insurance, you were offered an insurance product? And the one we're thinking about sort of actively at the moment is one where you have livestock insurance. So after 24 months at the moment, you're sort of, BRAC takes care of you for 24 months. But beyond that, you can graduate into using microfinance. Not everybody does. But if your cow dies beyond 24 months, then that's up to you what you do. So it would make a big difference if you could insure even the existing cows or the progeny of those cows. And there's now these technologies where they can use AI to take photographs of the muzzle of the cow and that, like facial recognition, basically, but for cows. And that makes it cheaper to offer the insurance. And the trick now is trying to think about whether you can get enough people to make it worthwhile for a private livestock insurer to come in and offer a premium that these people would find attractive, because then that would add an insurance component and we could then test whether that improves your investment incentive. So that's one one sort of block of work, which is more UPG focus. And as I said, in India with BRAC and with the government, we're trying to think about urban graduation. But I guess the third area, and this is really, really important for the urban context, and indeed for the rural context, is the model we have in our mind is a one of a big push. So in a typical welfare program, say in the US or the UK, you have, let's say you fall out of employment, so then you get a payment. And that payment is essentially there so you don't fall, your consumption doesn't drop into poverty. So you now, rather than getting money from your job, you take money from this payment and you maintain your consumption. The problem with the standard way of thinking about welfare is it has no impact on your occupation. So probably, say you're a construction worker, you fall out of employment, you get some unemployment payments, you go back, and you're probably going to go back into construction. It's not, that payment is not improving your human capital, is not allowing you to do any kind of new work. The idea of graduation is completely different, because what it's saying is we give you this big amount of money for two years, 24 months, and that allows you to jump into a different type of job. Because, it's not just you have to learn how to take care of that cow, you have to learn financial literacy, all the kind of complementary things. You're linked into chains to do with artificial insemination, chiller chains if you're producing milk. And that means you're doing a job with the resources you've had yourself, you never would have done, right? So what that means, if you think about a poverty trap, is that what we need to think about is so there's sort of two views of poverty. One is that we're poor because we have traits that make us poor. I don't know, we're not very motivated, we're not very smart, whatever. That's a sort of more right-wing view of poverty. The more left-wing view of poverty is you're poor because you lack opportunity. And essentially the second paper showed that latter view, the kind of lack of opportunity. So what we found is that women who would never have done livestock without the graduation program, many of them were now successfully doing livestock, and successfully many, many years after the intervention. What that means is that you need to think about something, a transfer, that is big enough to get you over that threshold that then means that you can do a new type of job. And I guess that the thinking where we've been working with BRAC on is, what are other means of doing that? It's not all going to be livestock, particularly in urban areas. And one obvious area is human capital training. So we've been working on the Prosper program, evaluating that. And I think that's the area that is probably going to be super important, because many, in urban areas, jobs are changing quickly. Are there ways in which we can jump people, provide the necessary training or assets or a combination that jump them into new jobs? So we've been talking a little bit to Munshi Suleiman about Cox's Bazar, and how maybe there's some stuff that women are reticent to go into the labor force in terms of leaving their houses. So there are things they can do from your house, coding and so on, that would give them the ability to earn income, but from their households, and connect to the global marketplace. And I think there's open thinking that's going to be very important, because obviously now we're much more on computers since COVID, and how do we leverage that in order to kind of get more people into more productive employment. But it could be simple things like training people to be carers, training people to be domestic servants, training people to be pharmacists or air hostesses, or whatever the market wants. And I think that we don't want to think of graduation just about livestock. It's a concept about how do you get people out of poverty traps. And the fundamental thing is that at some level we're all kind of born equal. There's nothing to tell us that the ability distribution is what the wealth distribution is. So the kind of tragedy of development is that many, many people, who have different abilities. It's not like there's a continuous distribution, who are not able to use them. And graduation is an example of how this transfer in rural areas of Bangladesh has allowed people to kind of better use their abilities to become slightly better off. But there's many ways in which you can think about how you would do that. A lot of the recent work I've been doing with Oriana Bandiera has shown that the number of types of jobs is very, very related to GDP levels. So if you take Brazil, for example, the Northeast is very poor. There's very, very few types of jobs. You go to Rio, there's lots of jobs. So if you're a software engineer born in the Northeast, there's no job for, so if you had a high ability as a software engineer, designer of some form, there's no outlet for that ability. Whereas if you move to Rio, you could. So can you move those job opportunities in by the internet, or can you move people into places that hard? But creating more opportunities, I think, is going to be a big part of the solution.
All right. Thank you so much, Robin, for the wonderful conversation. And then, of course, moving forward, it's not just for urban areas, as you said, but also in rural areas. We're seeing the need for diversification, new opportunities, just because of how Bangladesh is evolving, but also because of the changing climate.
Yeah.
So I guess having that agility and working, how do we make people more agile and be able to take advantage of opportunities, not just through the hard skills that we're talking about, but also the graduation programs. You started with this really, I think, very powerful imagery of women just being a little more confident, standing next to a, a local elite, being able to talk to somebody like that. And that faith in oneself, I think, is also a very important um, part of the puzzle.
Yeah.
And the program, maybe, it can teach a lot, and we can also learn a lot to understand how that can be combined with all the other skills, to go forward into a more climate adaptive, move forward in a more climate adaptive way. On that note, on that hopeful note, bye from Dinajpur. Thank you so much.